Welcome to our second panel session for the Progressive Conservative Summit this year, titled Cultural and Political Isms. So we're going to have a big discussion, but without further ado, I'm just going to throw it over to Jeff Paulette, our moderator for this panel session. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. I'm Jeff Paulette. I'm from Hope College in Holland, Michigan. I teach political science there, and I'll be moderating the panel, just asking questions and poking the conversation along as is needed. Let me introduce our two panelists here. Our first panelist immediately to my left is Dr. Dwayne Tunstall, who's an associate professor of philosophy here at Grand Valley. His areas of specialty are African American philosophy, classical American philosophy, and existentialism. His research interests include moral philosophy, phenomenology, philosophy of religion, and social and political philosophy. It's like everything but metaphysics, really. Tunstall's research explores how African American philosophy, existential phenomenology, and classical American philosophy can complement one another when thinking about issues of personal identity, race, and the legacy of Western modernity in the United States. He has written 2 books, Yes But Not Quite, Encountering Josiah Royce's Ethical Religious Insight, and Doing Philosophy Personally, Thinking About Metaphysics, Theism, and Anti-Black Racism. Dr. Tunstall has published over 20 journal articles and book chapters on a variety of topics, including diversity in education, idealism, race and racial identity, religion, and social philosophy. He is currently the Secretary of the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy and Executive Director of Philosophy Born of Struggle. He is also an editor of the Transactions of the Charles S. Peirce Society and co-editor of the American Philosophical Association newsletter on philosophy and the Black experience. He also serves on the editorial boards for the Acorn, Philosophical Studies in Pacifism and Nonviolence, Dewey Studies, and Marcel Studies. To my far left is Dr. Micah Watson, who is a native of California and a professor of political science at Calvin College. While he was in...
Come on.
Calvin...
Come on, Hope.
Calvin University.
Thank you.
I happen to be a graduate of Calvin College, and I can never get used to saying Calvin University. Being from California, he completed his undergraduate degree at UC Davis. He earned an MA in Church-State Studies at Baylor University and holds an MA and doctorate degrees in politics from Princeton University. He joined the faculty at Calvin College in the fall of Calvin University in the fall of 2015 after teaching at Union University. He was also selected to serve as the William Spoolhoff Teacher Scholar Chair for the 2015-2016 academic year and became the program director for Calvin's new PPE program in 2020. Also in 2020, he became the executive director of the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics and is currently the Paul B. Henry Chair in Political Science. He's the author of many articles, working on a book on C.S. Lewis, and has published widely on topics such as education, religious liberty, natural law, and evangelicalism, and faith in literature. So I'll begin by throwing a few questions out, and I emailed both panelists earlier this week and suggested that we do this. Roughly speaking, Dr. Tunstall is representing the progressive viewpoint and Dr. Watson the conservative viewpoint, although these labels I find never fit anyone perfectly. And I thought it might be interesting to start this way and have Dr. Tunstall begin by telling us what he thinks conservatism is, have Dr. Watson reply to that, and Dr. Tunstall an opportunity to reply in turn, and then flip it and have Dr. Watson tell us what he thinks progressivism is. So if you would like to go first and tell us what you think conservatism is.
First of all, I should state that I don't believe that there's one thing that you can point to and say that is conservatism. But for the purposes of this panel, I would like to talk about at least 2 different senses of conservatism. The first one is social and cultural conservatism, and the second one will be economic conservatism. with respect to social and cultural conservatism, I think about someone who aims to either maintain their view of how society ought to be and is rooted in traditional values, or what they would want to do is to have the government act as a means of reinforcing those values in society. Economic conservatives don't have to be conservative in a cultural sense. They can accept liberal values. However, with respect to how they view the role of government, at best it's meant to protect the social order. So you make sure that you have a strong military. You make sure that you have regulations to protect citizens and legal residents. You make sure that you have a regulatory standard so that markets can operate effectively and efficiently while protecting consumers. But beyond that, the government should just stay out of people's business. And sometimes I think about economic conservatism as a cousin to certain forms of libertarianism. They're not quite identical, but they are close enough in terms of how they view government that you can say for both of them, you have limited government as the goal.
Mike, does that sound right to you? You want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that captures a lot of it, and our speakers today have primarily talked about these questions in the American context, and I think that's a pretty good look at how conservatism expresses itself in the American context. I think Matt Yglesias had distinguished between almost like FDR liberals, and we think of, anti-New Deal conservatives, and then 1960s progressives or liberals, and then 1960s and following social conservatives. And I think that's pretty helpful. Yeah. So I have no. I think there's probably some teasing out we can do as far as the conservative versus libertarian approach. I think in some cases, from different starting points, they come to similar conclusions about the size of government. But then, as we see with some conservatives, they're more likely to be willing to use the levers of government, as you mentioned, with social policy. But yeah, I don't have we're supposed to disagree a little bit here and there, but I don't think I have much disagreement as far as that goes.
Okay. You want to take a shot then at what you understand progressivism to be?
Yeah, if I want to, when I was thinking about this week, getting your email, I wanted to take a step back, and I was thinking about both progressivism and conservatism and how those terms get used. And traditional is the other word, and we think about traditional, the root of that is what we want to pass on. So the Latin root of that is to pass on. We think about what we pass on to the next generation, or we pass on to our children. And it struck me that my progressive friends also have things they want to pass on, right? So there are things that they value enough that they want the next generation to learn. Same thing with my conservative friends. And then there's also, conservatives also want to make progress. Right? So if there's a goal and we think it's set and we can measure how we get there. So it strikes me in one level, both of the roots of the words can apply to either approach. And it struck me one way of distinguishing between the two is conservatives are more likely to be wary of what can go wrong. Abraham Lincoln in his Cooper Union address said, "What is conservatism? Is it not adherence to the old and tried against the new and untried?" And as there's a saying that goes around, traditionalism is not having to figure out each time which ones are the poisonous berries, right? That the fear is that you're going to mess things up. The particular danger there, I think, can be a complacency, can be a resting on one's heels when there is progress needed. And I think my progressive friends, they have both sides have an ideal of what human flourishing looks like. What does it take for people to live well? And my more progressive friends, and again, these are generalizations, but I think they would see, look how far we have between what we think is the ideal and where we are. And there's an urgency there, a moral urgency to reach that ideal, given the gap between the ideal and where we are, and to use the means of government and other entities to try and get there. Conservatives might say, yes, I can see that gap, but we worry more about what gets lost if we rush forward and what we might lose. So I think that's one dispositional difference to echo something David French said earlier, that there's a different almost personality to some extent. And each side, I think each way has their own particular liabilities. For conservatives, I think it's a danger of complacency. It's a danger of, well, it's working well for us, so we may not have to care as much about it not working well for other people. For progressives, I think the danger is what happens if we tinker with things that work relatively well and our pursuit of the perfect ends up damaging many things that aren't perfect but are still working fairly well or good.
Should we respond to that?
I want to acknowledge that there is a very real danger of trying something new with respect to policies that undermines the status quo, what people have taken for granted or what they've accepted. But there are many instances where what has traditionally been the case hasn't been working for many people. And I can give the standard groups that have been excluded and marginalized from traditional American society, such as African Americans, Latinx Americans, indigenous peoples, women, especially poor and working class women of all races and ethnicities, that what traditionalists would oftentimes accept as this is something that has worked, such as the nuclear family, economic policies that have benefited middle class to wealthy white people, especially cisgender, heterosexual, middle to upper class white men, has left a lot of people out. And even if there's a danger of implementing policies that would make society and our economic system more inclusive, it's not going to be necessarily worse than what the current conditions are for those groups.
So I think anyone who has a clear-eyed view of American history has to absolutely acknowledge what you just said. And so I would not even want to put that observation in conservative or progressive terms with regard to American history. I think both in the different generations, there have been conservatives who have been on the wrong side of some really important issues. I think progressivism has been on the wrong side of some important issues. So when it comes to the question of how to think about solutions, the conservative disposition is it can be a hesitance, and that's why I think that's the weakness, that when things need to change, there can be a stubbornness to change that is unhelpful. So I would agree with that. At the same time, there can be a desire to change or try new programs that do have unintended consequences. Now, sometimes people will disagree as to the reach or the range of those consequences. I think of the policy change of no-fault divorce in many ways had some good things that came of it, but also some unintended consequences that were quite harmful. So this isn't to say that the conservative kind of disposition of wariness is an elixir. I think I'm saying it's more explanatory. But I do think it's important, and that's why, as a conservative, I'm glad I have my progressive friends that can kind of push me on some things. But I'm also glad that there's a conservative disposition that wants to test what are these policies and will they help. But I certainly would agree there have been some incredibly terrible policies that have come out of both parties. I think about the legacy we still have from redlining, which came out of the FDR administration. And in my view, it is not conservative to resist, to either endorse the legacy of redlining because it's old. We don't want to conserve that. And conservatives should be behind finding good solutions to try and rectify the legacy of that. Where the differences may come in is the conservatives are more likely to want to have free market as well as government solutions. Progressives tend to be have more faith in what government can do. But anyway, so I would agree with that. I just don't know that I wouldn't want to say that all falls on the conservative side, kind of standing for the wrong parts of American history, and the progressive side, always progressing towards the right. I think they've mixed and crossed those streams throughout.
Dr. Tunstall, would you like to respond to that, or I can move on to the next question, Rachel.
I would say move on to the next question,
Okay.
but I have a sneaking suspicion
Yeah.
that any response I would make now is going to come up pretty much in the next question.
It very well might, or if not the next one, then the one after that. So Dr. Watson mentioned this idea of human flourishing. So I want to ask two questions related to this idea of human flourishing. And the first one I want to ask is that it's often understood that one of the differences between conservatives and progressives are competing conceptions of human nature. Conservatives having a more pessimistic view of human nature, and progressives perhaps having a more optimistic view of human nature. Do you think that's a fair characterization of both movements? So why don't you go first? And what difference would it make?
I would want to say that maybe for some progressives that may be the case, but you can be a progressive and acknowledge that humans tend to be confrontational. Humans tend to identify themselves with their group, the in-group, so us versus them. And you can acknowledge that these things are part of human nature, but there's also an element to being human that is creative, that isn't foreclosed by how people have acted in the past. Our tendencies to engage in conflict, our tendencies of identifying with an in-group and then excluding other people isn't the end of the story with respect to human nature. And there's plenty of progressives who would want to contend that even though we can't change human nature completely, that we can create institutions, rituals, practices, and adopt values that would make it so that people who have once been excluded can become included, or at least more integrated into society so that they can pursue their own visions of what it means to live well. And actually, I would say that for many progressives, it's not a question of being optimistic about human nature. It's more a push to meliorism. Progressives want to take what we can do and use it to help solve societal problems and include people who have once been excluded.
I suppose if we had the social science means to ask that question, we might find that it's descriptively there's something to it, insofar as you might find people who identify as conservative more likely to have a darker view of human nature. I teach at Calvin University, and obviously the Calvinist reform stream that comes out of Christianity tends to have a pretty strong view of depravity and original sin. But I think if we delve into the details, we'd find again that it's a more complicated story. Conservatives tend to think the military works pretty well. Pretty big organization, right? They don't have as much of a doubt about the military, that part of our government working well. And conservatives, if they're free market conservatives, tend to have a fairly strong trust in big companies and free markets to some extent if there's a system of free trade. So in some ways, the fallenness of human nature manifests itself differently among some conservatives, and that's true of progressives as well. So those of you who've been here all day, you've heard Professor Copeman, who's from Calvin, myself from Calvin, both representing the more traditional or conservative side, but I can assure you we're not the norm at Calvin. It's more center-left, and many of my colleagues there are very strong believers in original sin. How could you look at human history and not, well, I know people don't, but it seems it's one of the more verifiable doctrines of the Christian faith that there's something quite wrong with humanity. And so we would expect that to manifest itself in systems and in big institutions and things like that. So I do think that there is a wing of progressivism, and it may not be where Dr. Tunstall falls into, but there are some folks who are, for example, looking forward to the singularity, who see human nature as plastic, effectively, and we could get into the weeds as to where that comes from and go back to Rousseau and this perfectibility as being part of human nature. And if human nature is plastic such that we can change it, then I do think that opens up more room for possibility with a sort of things that we see from some movements now where you have lots of money being spent by tech billionaires on perhaps, getting past the whole mortality thing, and those that's a form of almost maybe techno-libertarian progressivism that messes up all our categories. That strikes me as quite optimistic, but I wouldn't want to, I think it would be wrong to tag progressivism with that. It's a weird strand of it, perhaps.
I don't know if I would want to label that as progressivism so much as, I don't even want to identify it with any political ideology. I think it's more of a hubris that with enough wealth and with enough technological advances that you can overcome human nature. And at least from my perspective and how I identify progressivism, that is going a step too far with what they're doing.
Amen. So I agree with that. I think so in that sense, you're my kind of progressive, right? Because you reject that, and then, we would also, I assume we both reject the progressive eugenics of the early 20th century that tried to get to a more perfect human race with incredibly unjust boundaries and decision-making, and saying these are the type of humans that matter and these are the kind that don't, right?
But in the early 20th century, progressivism covered virtually all of the major political parties. You had proponents of progressivism in the Democratic Party, progressives in the Republican Party, progressives in other parties, because that was part of what it meant to be an educated person in the United States oftentimes, is to accept eugenics, is to accept the idea that with technological advances and the advances of the experimental sciences, that you can use that knowledge to improve people.
Although their conception of what it meant to improve did have this very monochromatic, rationality biased conception, right? I think about Buck v. Bell, a Supreme Court case in which I think Oliver Wendell Holmes said, what's the line? Dr. Bullitt, it's three generations of idiots is enough.
Imbeciles are enough.
Yeah. So it was almost a scientism, a trust in progress wedded to a very, I don't mind using a moral term, I think a pretty wicked conception of what it had to mean to have human flourishing. And so I think it's a great, actually, that is some great progress that is, and we probably owe a lot of that, our current distaste for eugenics, to what we found the Nazis were doing after World War II. Although with things like the genetics we have now, it creeps in under different names, and I think both conservatives and progressives should be really wary of that as a danger we could agree on as a problem.
I think what you've just been discussing brings up a fairly significant topic, and that's the issue of limits. What are the limits for human beings? What are the limits of any political system? What are government limits and so forth? It does seem to be the case that in the early 20th century, at least, there was in the progressive movement very much this idea that natural limits, social limits and so forth could be transgressed, but that there really weren't limits. You could bring about the kingdom of God on this earth through human effort and through political activation. FDR's first inaugural address, he ends it with this idea of this vision of the millennium that's kind of consuming him. So it's one of the perennial temptations for human beings, I think, is this idea that they can bring about a kind of perfect society. They can bring the kingdom of God into the world here and now. Has that faith been lost among progressives? Is it there in residual form? Did conservatives ever have it? Did they have a version of it, perhaps, that looked a little different? Because my own sort of sense is most conservatives would just say, no, you're never going to be able to achieve any kind of perfection in these things. You can't perfect human nature, you can't perfect social life. Whereas progressives seem to have more faith in human ability to do that.
I'm wrestling with how I want to answer this question, because on the one hand, I am a proponent of, with human effort and working with our natural environment, that it is possible to, okay, I don't like using theological language oftentimes, but I'm going to use it now, bring forth the kingdom of God on earth through the efforts of humans working together to improve our condition. I do have some faith that we can do it, but not completely. I am a proponent of perfectibility, but not perfection. I do not think that human beings will be perfectly good and that you can use the government in order to transform us into perfect beings. However, I think that we can be better than what we currently are. And that when you engage in political activism, when you work with people at the grassroots level, when you talk to people who disagree with you, you're doing it because you want to create environments where more and more people can flourish, or at least live better than they currently live, have more access to those financial resources and other material resources that you would need in order to have a place to stay. Make sure that you have enough food to eat, that you are clothed, that you have access to a good quality education, that you live in neighborhoods that aren't subject to horrible pollution from either previous acts of corporations ruining those areas or current pollution of those areas. Live in a society where you can minimize, if not stop, racial discrimination from influencing who gets a job or who is even interviewed in the first place. I think that we can do those things. Again, I'm a proponent of perfectibility, not of perfection.
So I couldn't think of anything I would object to in any of those goals, right? In some ways, so the previous keynote speakers have been talking about the American context. I see the American political experiment as, in the beginning, having these grand promises and claims about human nature and about what is due in terms of opportunity, and then hopefully that will lead to good results. And then there's this other part, there's this counter interpretation, which is, this was Stephen Douglas's interpretation, this is Ta-Nehisi Coates's interpretation, that was just meant then for white men with property, right? The counter, Lincoln's interpretation, I think Lin-Manuel Miranda's interpretation, Hamilton, is that it was in practice so limited then, but part of the story of America has been how we have been working through fits and starts and through some terrible injustices and some advances to expand that promise so the realization is being more and more spread out and more people actually get to enjoy it. So I hope that's not a conservative or a progressive interpretation. I hope it's an American interpretation that conservatives and progressives can agree on. And then we will argue about how best to instantiate that vision, whether it's a government program or more of a free market solution or both. But I would see that as something where there would be some common ground. I do think, Dr. Paulette, to go back to your original question, I do think there is a more likely to have more faith in how quickly that can happen on the progressive side. But I also see a bit of that on the conservative side, at least in the conservative, if not civil war, close to it right now going on as to what really is conservatism, because among the wing of the Republican Party that is enamored with Trump, not holding their nose for Trump, but enamored with him, I think they were optimistic that he could bring back this perfection or this make America great again, this American Garden of Eden that didn't ever actually exist, but is a goal in their minds. So I do think that there is optimism there. If that's what conservatism is, and it's not, you can probably tell, not my brand of conservatism, then I do think that there's a faith in progress there among one particular branch of what goes by the name of American conservatism today. And it's a faith that a particularly a particular type of leader can take us back to this place, which for some people may have worked well, but for many others did not.
I'm thinking about Eliot's line, they dreamed of systems so perfect that men no longer needed to be good. It does seem that in some of these ideas of reform, there is this idea if you can just kind of get the systems right. Edward Bellamy, a very famous, important book, his book Looking Backward, there is a very important chapter in that book where they're talking about how they created utopia. They did that by transforming human nature, and the way they transformed human nature was just by taking them out of the muck of bad institutions and replanting them in good institutions. I guess my question would be, to what degree does institutional reform create personal reform?
I would say not as much as some progressives may think, but I think it's more than what at least some conservatives would want to grant. I shouldn't just leave everyone hanging with that one statement.
I always leave them wanting more, right? Yeah.
The great Harvard political philosopher Harvey Mansfield says, "We make our institutions, and our institutions make us." Right. So I think it's a reciprocal sort of process. I mentioned no-fault divorce earlier. There was a reason for that policy. It was because divorce is a hard, horrible, terrible thing, and it's stressful, and it takes too long. And so this was a policy that would streamline it, make it much quicker, and you could get out of a marriage and cut short that difficult ordeal for the husband and the wife and the kids. But one of the unintended consequences there was, when my grandparents got married, they knew getting into the marriage it would be hard to get out, which couldn't help but impact their decision to get into the marriage. Whereas my generation and later, no matter how committed we are to perhaps a strong view of marriage, we know in the back of our minds, to some extent, if things get rough, we can get out fairly. It's not easy emotionally, but legally a lot easier. Like the old black and white movies where the man or woman says, "I'm not going to give him or her a divorce." Well, that doesn't even make sense anymore. So in that sense, our policies do shape our mores, and then our mores also call for and influence policy. So I think that there's an element of this, they influence each other kind of with those things.
Well, since the issue of institutions has come up, there is a sense, I think, in which institutions are supposed to be formative in some fashion. They form the kinds of practices and habits, rules of conduct that the people who inhabit those institutions and work within those institutions are supposed to perform. It's supposed to direct their conduct in some kind of fashion. It seems in some ways our institutions have become more performative. And that is platforms that individuals use to kind of draw attention to themselves or draw attention to their causes. And part of that just seems to be a kind of weakening of our institutions themselves, that they no longer have that kind of formative capacity that they once did. They're now more performative than they are formative. Is that true? And if so, I think conservatives and progressives would agree that's a problem, if that's true. How might that be corrected? And I'm thinking in part, Americans have lost enormous levels of trust in our institutions. So that could be the very nature of the social crisis that we're facing.
I would say my issue with institutions, I can't speak for everyone who identifies as a progressive, but my issue with institutions is that many people realize that the institutions, how they're set up, do not help them. And when you find yourself in a position where the institutions that you belong to, the institutions that shape you either directly or indirectly, do not reflect what's in your best interest, you're going to lose trust in them. I would recommend that in order to rebuild trust in institutions, they would need to provide the resources and the framework, say in terms of rituals, in terms of even physical spaces for people to be together in such a way that they can live lives that are befitting humans. So institutions that will work to promote environmental sustainability, institutions that are equitable, that are willing to meet people where they're at and provide them with the means of participating in those institutions. So for example, when it comes to K through 12 education, making it so that your zip code doesn't determine the quality of education you receive, and that instead local, state, and federal government can provide the resources so that those schools can offer quality education for students. Now, how we do that in terms of policy, that's going to be difficult because we had to do things such as changing how local schools, public schools are funded. Thinking about what is the relationship between public schools, charter public schools, and private schools, and how they are funded or not funded on a local, state, and federal level. How do you get parents to be involved in their children's education, especially if you're a working parent who has to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to kind of hang on, economically speaking? Those are some of the things that I honestly do believe that we would need to address. In this case, just education, but you can think about this in other institutions as well.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you're asking, how do we fix everything, right? Because we think about we could talk about the political institutions, and there, I think we could talk a little bit about how, I mean, you could go back to the Kennedy-Nixon race, and the first debate that was televised, and the conventional wisdom is that because Kennedy got gussied up a little bit with the makeup and Nixon didn't, it hurt him, and from that on, I mean, image has always been part of politics and part of American politics, but from the 1960s to now, image and branding and marketing and all that sort of stuff has just ratcheted up, and people kind of instinctively know a lot of this is being sold to me as other things are in the market. And I think that hurts institutional credibility and faith, in addition to the scandals, right? But there's other institutions, and we have these terrible scandals going on in churches with abuse, and we have the terrible scandal at Michigan State with athletics, and we have the Me Too. So you have this crooked timber of humanity which runs through all of us and always has, whether you come with that from a religious background or just from your own 2 eyes. And then it's not a surprise if that crooked timber of humanity can be amplified in institutions. So I would agree. This is where we do need to continually reform and to assess and build into that assessment, knowing it's going to be imperfect people trying to solve it and trying to account for that, knowing we'll never. I like your line about perfectibility, but not perfection. And then there'll be different. That's where the debates will be. So the more conservative side, yes, public school needs reform, and vouchers could be part of that as well. And more progressive folks tend not to like the vouchers. You can have those debates about means, but agree on that's an end that we agree on that's needed for a better level of human flourishing.
Well, this makes me think of a particular question that, since you have 3 people who do political philosophy on this stage, it's kind of a political philosophy question, but I think it has a payoff for the audience.
Of course it has a payoff. It's political philosophy.
And that is, there's been a lot written in the last number of years about the idea of liberalism, a kind of serious criticisms of political liberalism itself and liberal political institutions. And we can see the effects of it, a kind of loss of due process in certain venues, problems in our electoral system, problems with legislative government. I mean, our legislatures have become inactive in a lot of ways or dysfunctional. The rise of executive power, the use of police power, both by local police forces, but also, the NSA or the intelligence agencies. And the other part of the criticism of liberalism comes from a kind of cultural side of things. The rise of personal autonomy, the rise of identity politics, the nature of the way that we talk about rights, for example. And these criticisms have come from both the left and the right. So I'm wondering if you would be interested in touching upon those arguments a little bit, and maybe think about why now have these criticisms of the whole liberal tradition gotten a certain purchase and been ventured forward now. And then, like, what are the implications exactly? And I want to get back to this issue of institutions also, but I think there's some interesting implications for this.
Okay, I'm going to get controversial here.
All right, here we go.
I would want to say that the liberal project, as it has unfolded for the last few hundred years in the West and Westernized societies, was founded on the subjugation of people who were not considered racially white. That the entire edifice was built on not only an equitable structure, it was built literally on the backs and bodies of non-Western people. And when you start to include white women in this as well, you really can see how, as demographics change over time and mores have changed such that we recognize that more and more people ought to be represented in not just government, but in society and as contributors to culture, there isn't a center there that everyone can agree on. And there was never a center there that everyone agreed on. It was more the use of force and traditional values to make it seem as though everyone at least acknowledged that this center was holding. And we are living through a time where the heart of liberalism, as it's traditionally understood, is morally bankrupt. And we're trying to figure out how can we take the best of the liberal tradition, such as respect for the individual, and make it so that it is accessible to more and more people while getting rid of the foundations of liberalism, as far as I'm concerned.
So you're arguing that it was morally bankrupt from the start.
From the start.
And so now we're kind of living with the realization
We are
of that.
living with the realization of it and the wreckage of going, yeah, this has been problematic, and we either will find a way of redeeming parts of it and building something new, taking the worst of it, ignoring that it was founded on something that was horrible, morally bankrupt, and continue to decline, or we can just stay at the status quo and have it so that we collectively don't trust our institutions. Not literally everyone, but most of us going, I don't know about this, and realizing, okay, this is why we kind of don't want to trust them, but not having a better alternative.
Wow. All right, well, I'll just name, it's going to be, there's a, it's going to be convenient. One's reaction to me saying, of course a white guy is going to say this. Okay, that white guy conservative. I would wholeheartedly endorse and agree that you cannot tell the story of the United States without including the American original sin, which is the subjugation not only of people of color, but Native Americans. And I guess the question I would raise then, so then that is the side of that it's been rotten from the core. We now do see that also from the right as well. We have folks who've made that argument from the right. And I guess as I think about that, I think there have been, I cannot say to any person who has come from the marginalized communities and say, well, here's why you should think like I do. That'd be not right for me to do. But then when I look at those marginalized communities, I see disagreement on this very issue among them. And so then I have to think, well, whose case do I find most persuasive, and we have to figure that out. And I also think, which society has been founded correctly from the start that didn't have the mark of Cain as part of it, right? That didn't have some kind of subjugation. And throughout the human history, I don't know what that is. And I'm also thinking of the question compared to what? So acknowledge, and I cannot do it justice. I think about, I have my students read, and I wish everyone would read every 4th of July Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Because for me, it's the best thing I can get, not at all experiencing anything close to what that's like, try to hear that voice. But I also see that when people in the world have had traumatic lives elsewhere, one of the places they've tried to get to, irrespective of their color or their background, has been here. And that there have been millions of people from all over the world, from places, they saw something here worth trying to get to. And some of them get here and they are treated terribly as well. Some get here and they've become Americans and they've flourished. And they will tell that story. So part of it is how, there's different interpretations of that story, and I think they all deserve respect. But I guess I just have to respectfully say I'm not persuaded that that's the only part of the foundation, that the subjugation part. That there's a promise there. It is not. We're still not there, and it has not been lived out as it should. But there's something there that has attracted people, even who were not of that privileged group of the white men with property, and that there's been an expansion there. I think, there's been this, part of the reason that liberalism is in doubt now, right? Every society needs a glue. The cult in culture refers to these kind of beliefs, and we've gone through a great sifting in the last 100 years. We've had a religious sifting. We're no longer Protestant, Catholic, Jew, like the book in the 50s. We have many more secular people, and religions are more diverse. We no longer have an existential foe in worldwide communism. We have, terrorism doesn't really work. There's no surrender place for terrorism like there would be for the end of the Cold War. And I think we're trying to figure out who we are. Most countries have, as their founding, a commitment to a common blood or a common soil or a common religion. And there's just a handful of countries in the world, and we're one of them, in which the identity of who you are as an American, in theory, not in practice, has been you don't have to look a certain way to come here. I could move to Japan and try and become a citizen and get fluent in Japanese. I will never be accepted as Japanese, ever. But someone from Japan could come here, and they may experience discrimination. They may be mistreated, but they can, I think, in practice and in theory, become accepted as an American. I think that's the promise that is, whether we think it's rotten from the beginning or it's mixed, that is what I hope people can agree on. We can try and kindle that flame and keep that idea alive, that we can have in common more than the differences that have been so exploited to mistreat each other in the past.
And that's something that I can actually agree with. But for me, it's more of an ongoing process that really didn't start in earnest until the last 70 or so years. And I agree with Baldwin in terms of we should strive to achieve our country. And I agree with you that we should work so that more and more people can be included in America, and by America, I'm concentrating on the United States, that leads to them flourishing, or at least have a better chance of flourishing. However, I can't say that the seeds of this was just automatically there in liberalism in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, for example. This is something that it was through literally the blood, sweat, and tears of many generations of people who fought so that we could get to the point of being more inclusive, not just in terms of paying lip service to it, but in terms of actually doing the work to make our institutions more inclusive. Okay, I won't get into the dangers of making institutions and culture more inclusive and expect people to assimilate. That's a whole nother issue.
Okay. Are you referring there to political institutions or any kind of social institution?
I would say any kind of social institution. I wouldn't limit it to political institutions. And here I'm shifting from talking primarily in terms of political philosophy to social philosophy.
Okay. Because it does seem to be the word of the moment in pretty much any institution that you can think of, this word inclusive. But did I hear you correctly that in any kind of social institution you could see limits to or problems associated with inclusivity?
It depends on what people mean by inclusivity. What do you want to include as a full participant in a particular institution? Here is one thing that I have been wrestling with seriously in terms of ideological diversity. Do I want to be in a reading group with someone who is a white supremacist in the sense that they literally belong to a white nationalist or group? Do I want to include that person in, say, a reading group that I belong to? Or would I want to establish something like that with them? No. Do I want to be in a bowling league with that person? No. However, if you're talking about inclusivity in terms of, say, local government, I don't know what that would quite look like. Can I imagine diversity? Yeah, you have two citizens who disagrees on a lot with respect to how they view the world and maybe how they think government ought to function and who ought to be privileged when it comes to governmental policies. I get how that works, but I don't know whether inclusivity goes that far or not. I hope it does, because if it doesn't, I think that we're screwed. I hope no one mind me going through what seemed to initially be a tangent, but I wanted to give a more concrete example of how inclusivity could play itself out first at a very, very local level, and then gradually shift it to its salience in a political sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think about those almost concentric circles that we have. I would not want to be in a reading group with a white supremacist either. Now, if I happen to have, and I don't, but if I had a white supremacist in my family, then I have a different, perhaps, pull to engage that person and hope and pray that they might come out of that. And there are people who make almost a ministry in their lives of trying to do that really radical reaching out, and that's great. That's certainly not for everybody to try and do that. If we're thinking about, you know, those concentric circles of who we interact with, we're actually grappling right now as a country with this. Who do we want to include when it comes to our posture towards vaccination? The NBA, right, is really dealing with this with a few players who aren't. Are they, you know, so I think this is an important question. I think that inclusivity, some of these words are magical almost, and they always mean the good thing. And so I appreciate the recognition that even with inclusivity, which generally is a good thing, it's going to depend to some extent on the context. So I think that's, I agree with that.
I want to get back to liberalism a little bit. Maybe this will get us back to what you had brought up earlier. One idea of liberalism is that it is a way of maintaining peace in social life when people disagree fundamentally about substantive goods. And so, if not liberalism, then what? What will allow us, if Dr. Watson's right, that we're kind of trying to figure out who we are, and we've got two really different ideas or two really different visions, or maybe even more than two, right? It could be 50 different visions about who we are. How can those visions be made to coexist peacefully, if not on something that looks like liberalism?
We can go down socialist route.
And make everybody think alike?
Of course not. That's not socialism. But I don't know if I personally would like to go that route, but you're asking what are some potential alternatives to liberalism as it has unfolded historically? I would say, on the one hand, we could work to, I'll say, retrofit it quite a bit so that you keep the respect for the individual. And if I go with John Stuart Mill and think about liberalism as providing a means for many, many people to conduct experiments in living, I'm going, okay, I like that aspect of liberalism. But is there a way that we can bring those aspects of liberalism into the early 21st century and have it so that it includes those people who have been marginalized and economically exploited and otherwise unjustly discriminated against? I think that could be possible if we're willing to put in the multi-generational work that it would take to retrofit liberalism. But I think that there are other political options that holds on to at least some version of those two values I mentioned that has a similar root to, say, political liberalism, but doesn't have to be identified with political liberalism. You could have a society and a government where certain industries are nationalized for the greater good and have it so that people have access to those things such as utilities, and I would include the internet amongst those, given the importance of the internet to our everyday lives, and securing access to the internet for people to be able to reach out and not only communicate with one another, but also do the things that you would need to do in order to live, much less live well. That you lessen the influence of multinational corporations in politics, as well as in people's everyday lives, in terms of their ability to fund politicians to do things that benefits them instead of benefiting the greater good. So I don't think that socialism should be considered, ooh, it's evil, we're going to take away people's individuality, we're all going to be automatons that are going to function to benefit the state. Because if that's what you mean by it, I'm scared of it too.
I mean, this idea of retrofitting, I think if I compare our situation to Western Europe and the Western European more democratic socialist approaches, you have a citizenry that wants robust social programs, and they're also willing to pay the taxes in the 50-60%. So both those things. Now, demographically, they're in trouble because you've got to have enough people coming behind you to pay for those things when you're needing, particularly when you're older, need those services. Whereas our two parties are almost, you can almost define our two parties as one of them preaches one side of that, which is the government programs, that'd be more likely to be Democrats, and the other side, the Republicans, the low taxes. So we want, I don't know what the metaphor is, it's not quite having our cake and eating it too, but we Americans kind of go back and forth between, yes, we want these programs, but we really don't like high taxes. And at some point we may have to figure that out. Or maybe that's where federalism can come in and you can do, let the states experiment a little bit more with that. If I'm thinking about the alternatives from the more conservative side, Dr. Follett, I'm thinking of the ones that I've seen have been primarily, there's a secular Trumpy version of this. From my own Protestant background, there are some movements, very reformed folks like in Moscow, Idaho, who would want to see a return to a more religiously infused governance. I love my Catholic friends, but there is a Harvard law professor, Adrian Vermeule, is one of many very smart Catholic thinkers who are looking back with, I think, rose-colored glasses as to when the Catholic Church was more involved with directing politics. And for both the Protestants and the Catholics, you can't even run your own churches right. How are you going to run the state? So I'm very skeptical of those approaches. And I do have this sort of, we are certainly imperfect muddling through, but I don't know what I want to see where has this worked well, such that we would think that liberalism is dead and needs to be done away with, this Flight 93 kind of thing where we're about to crash and burn. And yes, there are problems, but I want to know where's it actually worked before, where you, on the religious side, where you want to impose a more religiously informed government or run government, and then similarly on with the more progressive views as well. Is Denmark kind of what we're looking for? Is it, certainly not Venezuela, right? So these sorts of questions as to what works well and how we might get there in a way that respects individual rights and freedoms and things like that.
Well, we should have some time here for some audience questions. Is there anybody in the audience or anyone online?
I really appreciate your guys' time and expertise here today. The thing that keeps striking me is that we unfortunately don't have the Progressive and the Conservative Party. We have the Democratic and the Republican parties. Very curious to hear your thoughts on what you would do to change or improve the parties we do have to better align with the philosophies you've espoused today.
It's an interesting question. So the question is how to get the parties to align more with conservative progressive views, correct? Yeah.
Since I had to go for first.
Perfectly fair. I think if the most honest, blunt answer is I really don't know. If I'm thinking about the Republican Party and conservative, it's probably pretty clear. I don't think that the recent shift in the Republican Party is actually reflective of what conservatism means, in part because I agree with David French that and one of my mentors, Robert George at Princeton, that American conservatism means defending the ideals of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and the previous president, I think, would be happy to run roughshod over the Constitution if he could get his political goal. J.D. Vance recently said we should just take money from the Ford Foundation and redistribute it to people who mass immigration has hurt, which is just kind of illegal, right? So I think that conservatives need to patiently, winsomely, without calling their fellow citizens, just writing them off as deplorables or anything like that, try and just engage the real reasons that they are conservatives. I think we've heard, I think quite eloquently, that there are people who feel like they've been passed over, and that's true on the left and the right. Bernie Sanders appeals to a certain populism on the left, and people who are dealing with opioid-ravaged communities and the Rust Belt, and they've been, Trump appealed to them. So how can conservatives appeal to the genuine complaints that these people have about being passed over without, I think, giving into a more demagogic sort of solution? And that's going to be probably Thanksgiving Day conversations. There's a politics as personal aspect. And it's going to take some gumption among Republican office holders, and I would say our current representative here in Grand Rapids is one of them, who will say, I'm going to stand up for what I believe in, and if I lose an election over it, I still have my convictions. And we need more of those Republicans to stick by their conservatism and not think they've got to remain in office by any means necessary.
And to answer your question, I'm going to have to step outside of my areas of expertise. Now, this is going to sound Pollyannish. I honestly, truly believe that in order to have representation of genuine conservatives and a variety of possible conservative positions as well as progressive positions, we would have to have more than two political parties. I have no clue how to make that happen. I have some inkling about how the Democratic Party on a local state level could potentially become more progressive by having people come in at the precinct level and then at the city level and then state level, and doing it that way from the grassroots on up, taking over the more local aspects of say, the Democratic Party, so that you can field politicians or potential candidates who hold on to progressive values. and then run progressive candidates and do outreach in communities so that you can take over the narrative that progressives aren't monsters and horrible people who believe in evil, bad socialism, but instead want to have the government work for everyday, ordinary people and include people who have been excluded. And that, I feel like I bashed on white men too much. No, but you have plenty of poor and working class white men who have been left out of our current economic system. And I think that they should be included as well in a progressive, any type of progressive policy.
If I can take a crack at that also, the fundamental purpose of political parties is to nominate and elect candidates to office. And when you're doing that at a national level, you're doing it at a really difficult scale. And so political parties aren't particularly interested in necessarily having a point of view, except as it helps them win elections. And if you have to take roughly half a population of 330 million, you can't have a coherent ideology, if you want to call it that. The only way, I mean, we would have to change our electoral laws. You'd have to get rid of single-member winner-take-all districts, for one thing, in order to create some sort of multi-party system. But I think one way to get traction on this is a kind of devolution process. You know, what a conservative party looks like in Holland, Michigan is going to be different than what a conservative party looks like in San Francisco. And what a progressive party looks like in Manhattan is going to be different than what a progressive party looks like in Grand Rapids. And so I think you'll have more functional parties and more coherent parties if we devolve our politics. So I think there's a kind of federalist response that I think can kind of help that problem.
So this question's coming in from our YouTube stream. Each of you have talked about human nature. Do you believe that ethical leaders with real integrity can, as Lincoln said, help bring out our better angels? Thank you.
I think the answer is yes. I think that if the question is, can it happen? I know the answer is yes, because it has happened. I can think of things that I appreciate about President Obama, things that he has said, the policies he has supported. Of course, as a conservative, I was not in favor of much of his political agenda. And then there's been cases where there's been politicians on my own side of things that I very much appreciated. So I do think it's possible. I think there's also something to the proverb that we get the leaders we deserve. And if that's true, then I think that's a bit of an indictment on the American people. I think we have been a little bit too addicted to what's flashy and makes us feel good as opposed to what might make for good governance. The skills needed today to get elected are not necessarily the skills needed to govern well. And so I do think it's possible. I think we have some examples of that, Lincoln being one. We need more like that. And I think part of that is statesmen and women from both parties who, again, figure out what they believe and say, and come to the public and say, this is what I believe, and this is what I will champion, and then are willing to actually lose an election if you know, the people go the other way. I think so. Quick example would be Jack Kemp. Has been passed away for quite some time, but when he was a player, he was Bob Dole's vice president. He was a player in presidential politics, and California had a law that was going to restrict, I think, immigration in a particularly, he thought, and I agree, unjust way. This is Prop 187, I believe, and he and William Bennett both opposed it. And he said he knew this would cost him, this would hurt him in the Republican primaries. He says, I love my party, but I love the truth more. And it did cost him in the primary. So I think examples like that, even though in the short term it might have hurt him politically, I think in the longer term, that's the healthy sort of thing that both parties need, is someone who calls us to what's right and what we believe in, even if it's going to cost us politically. At the same time, of course, you do have to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You do have to win, so you do have to play the game to some extent. It just now seems like it's the ratio is way off. It's all game, or 90% game and 10% principle. I'll stop.
And I pretty much agree with everything that Dr. Watson has just stated. I would want to add, though, that until we make it so that money isn't a primary driver of political campaigns, you can be as ethical as you want to be as a leader. You can act on your principles as you engage in your daily activities. But there are certain things that if you try to do and you pushed it far enough, you could have someone primary you, for example, who is funded by corporations that will pour funding not so much to prop up your opponent, but to undermine you. And until we really start working and reforming that system seriously, some ethical leaders may do some things, but it's not going to be enough to radically transform our current system.
The correct answer to that question is no. It's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because of the mechanisms by which we are producing our leadership class. So we have a leadership class that is not only corrupt, it's illiterate. The Better Angels line comes from Lincoln's first inaugural address. And if you read that address, it is filled with all kinds of references to classical literature, religious references, certainly the King James Bible. Right? Lincoln was illiterate. He was learned, and he could craft that into a compelling vision that would resonate with the populace, because the populace shared the culture. They were formed by the same imaginative world. And so when Lincoln is appealing to the better angels, he's appealing in a certain sense to the shared culture that people have that is grounded in a tradition and grounded in great texts and classical texts. Even if we could produce a leader who could make a speech like Lincoln's, I don't think we can. Even if we could, it would never resonate in the public. I'll give you an example of this. One speech I have my students read is Lincoln's Lyceum Address, which is filled with all kinds of biblical references. I teach at a Christian college, and I'll ask students about some of these references, and they'll have no idea what he's talking about. Right, so, I mean, in order for a story to work, there has to be those kinds of levels of shared literacy. There has to be that shared culture. We just don't have a shared culture. So the speech would never resonate with the public, even if somebody could craft one.
So, yes, but he's also giving that speech at a fairly divided time later on, not the Lyceum, but the first inaugural. So the dividedness, I mean, even then the shared cultural literacy wasn't enough. But also, you know, we're not historical determinists, right? We don't think that it's always going to just go south. There have been great awakenings, right? And again, since you and I both do teach at Christian colleges, even though we're fortunate here to be at a public school here, hope is a theological virtue as well as a nice school on Lake Michigan, right? So, you know, what does it look like to try and have a revitalization, or at least work towards that? Isn't it possible that are there some stories that still resonate across the United States? This may sound cheesy. I think the success of Hamilton is kind of an example of that. It's an American story that seems to have crossed both political and race and class lines in some ways, and it's got criticized for certain things. So I don't know. I'm not sure I want to quite say it can't happen, but we may differ on that.
All right, well, let's have a round of applause for our afternoon panel session.